statistics and research methods that he has to try to narrow down who this person is responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. What is your profile for who this suspect could be?
3 months. No arrest. No body. No explanation that holds together from start to finish. Over 30,000 tips have passed through the hands of investigators. A reward sitting at more than $1.2 million remains unclaimed. And a case that once felt like it was moving, building, closing in on something has quietly, unmistakably stalled. Most people following the story assumed they understood what it was about. The Bitcoin demands pointed in one direction.
Yeah, Trim and Troy, good afternoon to you both. You may remember Friday night. This was a big night in this investigation when very late at night, law enforcement were executing a search warrant here in the Catalina Foothills area. It was this home just over my shoulder. It's only about 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's own home. They were also taking a pretty close look at a Range Rover that was parked at a Culver's just a couple of miles away from here as well.
The deadlines that came and went pointed in the same direction. Even the figure captured on security footage, a man who moved with calm, deliberate control, gloves on his hands, backpack on his shoulders, suggested someone who had constructed a plan around a specific outcome. And that outcome, the one almost everyone accepted without question, was money. That assumption just collapsed. On April 30th, journalist Brian Entin sat down with two of the most experienced criminal profilers in the history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What they said in that interview did not simply add a new theory to an already complicated case. It dismantled the framework that had been driving the investigation from the very beginning. According to them, the entire direction has been wrong. Nancy Guthrie was never the target. Let that land for a moment. Not the target. Not the primary focus. Not the reason someone entered that home on the night of January 31st with a plan they had been building long before that door ever opened. The target was her daughter. The woman the world watches every morning on the Today Show. The woman with the camera pointed at her face, the platform, the reach, the public life. The woman who, by every measure of visibility and access, should have been the harder person to reach. Savannah Guthrie.
There is a moment in every investigation when everything changes. Not because of one dramatic discovery, not because of a single piece of evidence, but because the story someone has been telling stops matching the facts.
And Nancy, private and quiet, living the kind of life that does not make headlines, was simply the door that could be opened. Hi viewers. Here is a question that has been sitting at the center of this case since the very beginning, and the answer matters more than most people realize. Do you believe the ransom demands were real, or do you think they were always meant to mislead investigators? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Because what two retired FBI profilers just confirmed changes everything about how this case should be read. And it starts not with the night Nancy disappeared, but with something that began years before anyone ever saw it coming. James Fitzgerald spent decades inside the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. He is also a forensic linguist, someone who studies not just what people do, but how they communicate, what their words reveal about the architecture of their thinking.
But on the night of January 31st, 2026, that silence was weaponized.
Raymond Carr worked alongside him in that same world, building profiles from behavioral patterns, from escalation curves, from the documented history of how fixation moves from thought into action. These are not commentators offering theories from the outside. These are men who built the science that investigators use to identify dangerous individuals before the moment of violence. And when Brian Entin asked them to assess this case, both of them arrived at the same place. This was never about money. Fitzgerald was specific about one detail that makes that conclusion nearly impossible to argue with. On the night Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home, there was no ransom note left at the scene. Think about what that means. If someone enters a home with the intention of collecting a ransom, the note is how the transaction begins. It is the first communication. It is how the terms are established and the clock starts. Without a note at the scene, there is no transaction. There is no negotiation. There is only a person who came for something else entirely. The notes that appeared afterward, the ones attached to Bitcoin demands and anonymous email accounts, Fitzgerald's assessment was direct. Those were not from the person responsible. They were opportunists. People who saw a high-profile disappearance connected to a famous name and inserted themselves into the chaos hoping to extract something from the confusion. The actual perpetrator had no interest in cryptocurrency deadlines. Their interest was something that cannot be transferred into a digital wallet. Something psychological. Something personal. Something that had been building for years before a single camera ever captured a single frame of what happened on January 31st. Raymond Carr described it as a stalking-type progression. Not a decision made in a moment of desperation. Not an impulsive act that escalated beyond what was intended. A calculated, gradual escalation that moved through recognizable stages. Observation from a distance. Attempts to establish some form of connection. Boundary testing. And then, at some point along that curve, a shift. The passive became active. The distant became direct. And someone who had spent years watching from the edges of Savannah Guthrie's world finally moved toward the center of it. Not toward Savannah. Toward the one person connected to her who was reachable. Fitzgerald pointed to something that most investigators had likely considered, but never publicly confirmed. Over the course of a career as visible as Savannah Guthrie's, working at one of the most recognized broadcast networks in the world, the volume of correspondence that passes through is staggering. Letters, emails, social media contact attempts, messages that cross lines and get flagged and get filed away. Fitzgerald spent time in his FBI years working directly with the head of security at NBC's 30 Rock, dealing with exactly this category of behavior. Mostly directed at women. Mostly dismissed as manageable. Mostly never escalating beyond a file and a note and a decision to monitor. But some of them do escalate. And Fitzgerald's position is clear. Investigators need to go back at least 5 years through every piece of correspondence Savannah Guthrie received. Every unusual message. Every email that came in more than once from the same account. Every contact attempt that was logged and moved past. Because inside that record, there is almost certainly a name. A pattern. A moment where something crossed a line and someone noticed it but did not yet know what it meant. That moment may now be the most important piece of evidence in this entire investigation. The Bitcoin trail confirmed what the profilers suspected. The family believed they had found a way to trace the address attached to the ransom demands. They had not. The FBI invested significant resources attempting to identify the email accounts used in those communications. The trail went cold. Harvey Levin reported it directly. The account was set up to be untraceable. The Bitcoin address was visible, but who received the funds was not. Whoever built that part of the operation understood how to move without leaving a footprint in a digital environment. That is not impulsive behavior. That is preparation. That is someone who thought carefully about what came after, not just what came during.
Because the man on Nancy's porch at 1:47 a.m. had a walk, too. And within hours, side-by-side comparisons were everywhere. The gait, the shoulder roll, the stride length. Thousands of people watching 2 clips on a loop asking the same question. Is that the same person? I am not here to answer that question with a TikTok overlay. I am here to show you something bigger.
And according to Fitzgerald and Carr, that level of preparation is entirely consistent with the person who had been planning this for a long time. Not weeks, not months, years. The kind of sustained attention that builds a detailed picture of someone's private world from the outside. Nancy Guthrie's location, her living situation, the rhythms of her daily routine, the layout of a home she lived in quietly, far from the public spotlight her daughter occupied. That knowledge does not come from one search. It does not come from a lucky observation or a single conversation overheard. It comes from sustained, deliberate, patient study of a target that was chosen not randomly, but strategically, because she was the closest reachable point to the person this was really about. 3 months of investigation. 30,000 tips. A reward that has not moved a single credible lead across the finish line. That is not because the answer does not exist. It is because for 3 months, a significant portion of the investigative energy has been aimed at the wrong question. The question was never who wanted money from the Guthrie family. The question is who had a fixation on Savannah Guthrie that ran deep enough and long enough to eventually bring it to her mother's front door. And somewhere in a file that has already been created, in a message that has already been sent, in a name that has already been logged by someone at some point, that question has an answer. The profilers believe it is there, and they believe it is waiting. There is a specific kind of person who does not announce themselves. They do not leave traces that are easy to read. They do not fit the profile that most people carry in their heads when they imagine someone capable of something like this. They are not visibly unstable. They are not loud. They do not make the kind of mistakes that draw attention before the moment arrives. They watch. They wait. They study. And by the time anyone realizes what they were doing, the watching and waiting and studying has already translated into something that cannot be undone. James Fitzgerald knows this type of person better than almost anyone alive. He spent the formative years of his FBI career inside the Behavioral Science Unit, the division that would eventually evolve into the Behavioral Analysis Unit, the BU, the group responsible for developing the science of criminal profiling into something that could be taught, replicated, and applied to active investigations. The work began with interviews, not hypotheticals. Not academic exercises. Actual sit-down conversations with convicted serial offenders, conducted after sentencing, after the appeals had run their course, after the reality of a life inside a prison had settled into something permanent and inescapable. 38 offenders. Interviewed one by one. The approach was deliberate. Investigators waited until the offender had reached a specific psychological state. The state of someone who has lost all control over what happens to them. Who understands that the world outside will continue moving while they remain fixed in place. Who feels the slow approach of obscurity and cannot stop it. At that point, the behavioral scientists made an offer. Not leniency. Not freedom. Something the offender wanted more than either of those things. Significance. They told these men that they wanted to learn from them. That their cases were being studied. That what they knew could shape how law enforcement understood and responded to future crimes. And one by one, the offenders agreed to talk. Because being studied felt better than being forgotten. And in that agreement, they handed over something they did not fully understand they were giving away. The architecture of how they thought. That early work was anecdotal, interviews without a standardized structure, shaped by the individual dynamics of each conversation. But it built the foundation. And from that foundation, Fitzgerald's unit eventually developed a formal protocol, 840 questions, applied to every offender who agreed to participate, covering every crime they had committed, building a database of behavioral patterns so detailed and so specific that it could eventually be used to work in reverse, to start with the behavior visible at a crime scene and work backward toward the type of person who produced it. That database exists today. And it is one of the tools now being applied to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Raymond Carr worked inside that same world. He understands the mechanics of escalation not as a theoretical concept, but as a documented pattern that has repeated itself across hundreds of cases with enough consistency to be predictable. And when Carr looked at what is known about this case, the profile of the victim, the method of approach, the absence of a ransom note at the scene, the calculated behavior visible on camera, he saw something he recognized. Not opportunism, not desperation, fixation. There is a difference, and it matters enormously for how this investigation should be directed. Opportunistic crime is reactive. It responds to circumstances. It exploits a vulnerability that presents itself in a moment. Fixation-driven crime is the opposite. It creates the circumstances. It identifies the target, studies the environment, maps the access points, and then waits for the conditions to align. The person responsible is not responding to an opportunity. They are executing a plan that has been constructed over time, refined through sustained observation, and finally activated when everything they had prepared for came together. Carr described the escalation curve with precision.
While Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter and co-host of NBC's Today Show, had been visible everywhere, on television, at community events, in press conferences, her voice steady and then strained, and then something harder than grief. Tommaso had remained behind his lawyers, present in the background, silent in every way that mattered publicly.
It begins with observation. A person at a distance, consuming public information, tracking a public figure's movements and appearances and statements. This stage is invisible because there is nothing illegal about it. Millions of people follow public figures. Most of them never move past observation. But for a small number, observation is not enough. It creates a hunger for closer access, for some form of acknowledgement, for a connection that does not actually exist to feel real in some way. So they attempt contact, a message sent, an email written, a social media interaction initiated. Most of the time these attempts are ignored or filtered out by the infrastructure that surrounds anyone with a significant public platform. And for most people, being ignored ends the attempt. They move on. They redirect. But for a person whose fixation has crossed a certain threshold, being ignored does not end the attempt. It intensifies it. Because now there is not just a desire for connection. There is a perceived rejection that needs to be resolved. The attempts continue. They change in tone. They change in frequency. And somewhere in that progression, a line gets crossed that moves the behavior from uncomfortable to dangerous. Not all at once. Not in a way that announces itself clearly. Gradually. In increments small enough that each individual step seems almost manageable compared to the last. Until it is not manageable at all. Fitzgerald made a point that cannot be understated. In his years working security-related cases involving NVC personnel, the correspondence directed at on-air figures was constant. Letters, phone calls, contact attempts from individuals whose relationship with the public figure existed entirely in their own minds. The head of security at 30 Rock dealt with these cases regularly. Most of them were managed without incident. Filed, monitored, assessed for immediate threat level, and moved past. But the files exist. Every contact attempt that was ever logged, flagged, or reported in connection with Savannah Guthrie's public career is a potential data point in this investigation. And Fitzgerald's direction to investigators is specific. Go back 5 years at minimum. Look at the correspondence not just for what it says on its surface, but for what it reveals about the person sending it. Look for patterns. Look for escalation within a single correspondence history. Look for the moment where something shifts from admiration to something that reads differently, something with an edge, something with a claim in it. Something that suggests the person on the other end of that message believes they have a relationship that the recipient does not share. And then look at whether any piece of that correspondence referenced Nancy. Because that detail, if it exists, narrows the pool dramatically. A person who fixates on a public figure does not typically research the private family members unless the fixation has reached a stage where the public figure themselves feels inaccessible. When the attention shifts toward family, it signals a specific kind of desperation. An attempt to find a point of entry into a world that has resisted every direct approach. Nancy Guthrie was not a public figure. She was not visible. She was not accessible in the way her daughter was. Which means identifying her location and her routine required a level of deliberate research that goes far beyond casual attention. That research is a behavioral signature. And behavioral signatures, once identified, are traceable. The investigation now has a direction it did not have before April 30th. Not a financial trail that dissolves in an untraceable digital wallet. A behavioral one, rooted in documentation that already exists.
Question about 3 specific dates that federal investigators have publicly flagged, and nobody on the internet has fully connected yet.
Waiting in correspondence that has already been sent and received and stored somewhere in the infrastructure of a major television network and its security apparatus. The answer to who did this may not require a new breakthrough. It may require looking more carefully at what has already been there. There is something deeply unsettling about watching someone who is not afraid. The figure visible on Nancy Guthrie's security footage did not rush. Did not hesitate in the way someone would who had not been there before in their mind, who was encountering the environment for the first time. The movements were measured. controlled. The kind of calm that does not come from accident or luck. It comes from preparation. From having walked through the scenario enough times in the mind that the physical execution of it feels familiar before it even begins. Gloves, backpack, deliberate pace. This was not someone improvising. But here is what James Fitzgerald and Raymond Carr concluded when they assessed that footage in the context of everything else known about this case. The person visible on that camera, the one whose image has been studied and analyzed and distributed publicly for 3 months, is most likely not the person who designed this. He looks like someone following a plan someone else made. Think about that distinction carefully, because it changes the entire shape of what investigators are looking for. If the man on camera is the architect, the investigation is looking for one person with a specific and highly organized profile. But if the man on camera is executing a plan that was constructed by someone who never appeared on any footage at all, the investigation now has 2 distinct individuals to identify. One visible, one invisible, one who was present at the scene, one who may never have come anywhere near it. Fitzgerald described what he called edges in the behavior on that footage. Small inconsistencies. Moments where the precision has a quality that suggests familiarity with the instructions rather than familiarity with the environment itself. A person who has been in a space before, who chose it, who studied it, who designed the approach to it, moves differently than a person who was handed directions and followed them. Both can appear calm, but the texture of the calm is different. And in this footage, the texture suggests the latter. Someone gave him the layout. Someone told him what to expect. Someone had already done the work of understanding that space well enough to translate it into a set of instructions that another person could follow without having built the knowledge firsthand. That second person is the one this case is really about. Former FBI Assistant Director John Miller stated publicly that the person responsible for this is most likely local. Someone with specific and detailed knowledge of the Tucson area and of Nancy Guthrie's living situation. That assessment aligns directly with what the behavioral profilers described. You cannot acquire the kind of knowledge required to plan something like this about a private individual from a distance. Not the physical layout of a home. Not the specific rhythms of a daily routine. Not the timing of arrivals and departures. Not the details of how a quiet, private elderly woman moves through her days. That kind of knowledge requires proximity. Physical or sustained digital proximity to the specific environment over a specific period of time. And proximity of that kind, maintained over enough time to produce that level of detail, leaves traces. Not necessarily visible ones, but traceable ones. A car seen in a neighborhood more than once. A question asked that seemed casual at the time. A search conducted. A conversation that touched on details no one outside a specific circle should have known. Somewhere in the weeks and months before January 31st, the person who constructed this plan was present in the orbit of Nancy Guthrie's world. Not dramatically. Not in a way that announced itself. But present enough to learn what they needed to know. And someone, somewhere, may have seen something they did not yet understand to be significant. Raymond Carr made a point about the ransom component that adds another layer to this. The Bitcoin demands, the anonymous emails, the deadlines that came and went without resolution, none of it behaved the way actual ransom communication behaves. In a genuine kidnapping for financial gain, the communication is purposeful and direct. There is a clear mechanism for how the exchange happens. There is a reason for every element of the communication because every element exists to move toward the transaction. But the communications in this case had no clear mechanism. They appeared through local media. They did not establish a credible path to completion. Carr's read on this was consistent with Fitzgerald's. These communications came from outside the crime, from people who saw an opening and took it. The actual person responsible had already achieved what they came for. They had no interest in the ransom conversation because ransom was never what this was about. What it was about was something Savannah Guthrie said out loud before any profiler said it publicly.
There is a moment in every investigation when everything changes. Not because of one dramatic discovery, not because of a single piece of evidence, but because the story someone has been telling stops matching the facts,
In her first interview after her mother's disappearance, speaking to her colleague and close friend Hoda Kotb, Savannah said the thing that was most painful to consider. That it was too much to bear to think that she had brought this to her mother's doorstep. That it had happened because of her. She was not speaking from a place of guilt alone. She was speaking from a place of understanding. Because Savannah Guthrie has lived a public life long enough to know what comes with it. She has received the letters and the messages and the contact attempts that are part of the reality of being a visible woman with a national platform. She knows that not all of that attention is benign. She knows that some of it sits in a different category, a category that her security team takes seriously, a category that the people around her have always worked to manage. And in the weeks after her mother disappeared, as the ransom notes pointed investigators toward a financial motive that did not feel right, Savannah was already arriving at the conclusion that two retired FBI profilers with decades of combined experience would later confirm publicly. This was not about money. It was about her. And the most painful dimension of that conclusion is that it means the person responsible was not a stranger to Savannah's world. They were part of it in some way, even if only from the outside looking in. They knew enough about her life to identify her mother. They knew enough about her mother's life to plan an approach. They had studied the distance between Savannah's visibility and Nancy's privacy and found a way to use that distance as a pathway. That is not random. That is targeted. And a targeted crime of this complexity, built on this level of research and preparation, does not stay invisible forever. The behavioral trail exists. The correspondence trail exists. And the investigative direction that Fitzgerald and Carr have now provided gives investigators a framework for finding the intersection between those two trails. The intersection is where the answer lives. And the people who built the behavioral science that is now being applied to this case believe it can be found. 30,000 tips. Say that number slowly and let it settle. 30,000 separate pieces of information, observations, theories, names, and details submitted by members of the public over the course of 3 months. Each one reviewed. Each one assessed. Each one chased down to whatever endpoint it offered. And the case has stalled. A source close to the investigation confirmed this to News Nation. Most of those leads have failed to produce anything actionable. The investigation is not cold in the technical sense because active work is still being done and not every tip has been fully exhausted. But by every visible measure, the broad public tip pool has not produced the breakthrough that a reward of more than $1.2 million should theoretically be capable of producing. That number matters. $1.2 million is life-changing money for the overwhelming majority of people. In most cases involving multiple individuals or a connected network of people with shared knowledge, that kind of money breaks the silence eventually. Someone talks. Someone decides that loyalty or fear is worth less than what is being offered. Someone makes a calculation and picks up the phone. But here the silence holds. 3 months in. The reward unclaimed. The tips processed and set aside. Why? There are two possibilities that both point in the same direction. The first is that the people who know something are more afraid of the person responsible than they are motivated by the financial reward. Fear of that magnitude does not come from casual association. It comes from knowing specifically what someone is capable of and believing that the threat of exposure carries consequences that no amount of money can offset. The second possibility is that the people who have the relevant information do not yet understand that what they know is relevant. They have a piece of the picture, but not enough of the surrounding context to recognize it as significant. They saw something. They heard something. They knew someone whose behavior shifted around a specific period of time. But without the framework to connect that observation to this case, it sits unconnected, unexplored, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Both of those possibilities carry the same implication. The answer is not in the broad public. It is in a small, specific environment. A circle of people with direct or indirect proximity to either Savannah Guthrie's world or Nancy Guthrie's daily life in Tucson. And the 30,000 people calling in from across the country, most of them sincere, most of them genuinely motivated to help, were never going to find the person sitting inside that small circle. Because that person does not exist in the general public consciousness. They exist in a specific file, in a specific correspondence archive, in the memory of a specific individual who encountered them at some point and noticed something, but did not know yet what to do with the noticing. Brian Entin has been following this case with a level of access and continuity that very few journalists have sustained. His reporting in the weeks after Nancy's disappearance established details that shaped how the public and, to some extent, how investigators framed the early stage of the case. And his April 30th interview with Fitzgerald and Carr represents what may be the most significant single development in public understanding of this case since the night it began. Because the profilers did not just offer a new theory, they redirected the investigative lens. Stop looking at the financial motive. Start looking at the behavioral one. Stop processing tips from a general public that has no proximity to the relevant environment. Start reviewing correspondence that was generated inside a specific orbit around a specific public figure over a specific period of time. Stop asking who wanted money from the Guthrie family. Start asking who had a fixation on Savannah Guthrie that was documented somewhere, at some point, by someone whose job it was to notice. That redirection is not a minor adjustment. It is a fundamental reorientation of where the most productive investigative energy should be applied. And it comes at a moment when the case needs it. Because 3 months in, with 30,000 tips processed and a reward sitting unclaimed, continuing to move in the same direction while expecting a different result is not a viable path forward. The profilers understand this. The investigators working this case understand this. And on May 6th, when the CW airs its national special on Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, a second wave of public attention will hit this case with the kind of intensity that only a major broadcast can generate. Second waves are different from first waves. The first wave of attention floods in from everywhere, broad, unfocused, shaped by whatever framing the early reporting established. The second wave is more filtered. People who have been living with this case for 3 months, who have followed the details, who have processed the evolving information, who have sat with their own observations and decided somewhere along the way that what they know might actually matter. Those are the people a second wave reaches. And pressure of that kind, sustained and focused, has a specific effect on the kind of silence that is held in this case. It does not break the silence directly. It increases the weight of it. It makes maintaining the silence more difficult for the person carrying it, because silence requires effort. It requires active daily maintenance. And as the weight of it increases, the effort required to sustain it grows. At some point, something slips. A conversation gets overheard. A detail gets mentioned to someone who is not supposed to hear it. A behavior that has been explained away for 3 months finally registers as wrong to someone who had been telling themselves it was not their place to say anything. One detail connecting to another detail. One conversation leading to one phone call. One tip that is not like the 30,000 before it, because it comes from inside the circle instead of outside it. The investigation is waiting for that moment. The profilers believe it is coming. And the framework they have now provided, the behavioral trail, the correspondence archive, the profile of a fixation-driven escalation that began years before January 31st, gives investigators the tools to recognize that moment when it arrives and to act on it before it can be buried again. 30,000 tips and a silence that holds. But silence is not the same as permanence. And somewhere in the specific, contained environment where the answer to this case lives, the weight of 3 months is pressing down on something that was not built to hold it forever. Before any profiler spoke publicly. Before any behavioral assessment was put on record. Before the language of fixation and escalation and psychological motive entered the public conversation around this case, one person had already arrived at the conclusion that 2 of the FBI's most experienced criminal profilers would later confirm. Savannah Guthrie knew. Not with certainty. Not with the kind of documented, evidence-backed confidence that investigators require before they can act on a theory. But in the way that a person who has lived inside a specific kind of visibility for long enough develops an instinct for what that visibility can attract. She understood something about what had happened to her mother that the public framework of financial motive and ransom demands had not yet reached. She said it out loud. In her first interview after Nancy's disappearance, speaking to her colleague Hoda Kotb in a conversation that the world watched, Savannah said the thing that no one wanted to hear stated plainly. That it was too much to bear to think that she had brought this to her mother's doorstep. That the reason Nancy was gone was because of her. That is not a daughter collapsing under guilt. That is a woman who understands the specific terrain of having a public life, of being watched by millions, of knowing that most of the attention is harmless and some of it is not. She has lived inside that reality long enough to know that the line between admiration and something more dangerous is not always visible until it has already been crossed. And in the days after her mother disappeared, as the ransom notes pulled investigators toward a financial explanation that did not fully fit, Savannah was already looking in a different direction. James Fitzgerald said it clearly. He cannot believe that over the years, Savannah Guthrie has not been receiving the kinds of communications that come to every woman with her level of public visibility. Emails, social media messages, contact attempts that range from enthusiastic to unsettling. In his years working security cases at NBC's 30 Rock, this was the consistent reality for women in prominent on-air roles. Most of those communications were manageable. Most of them never became anything more than a file in a security database. But the files are there. And Fitzgerald's direction to investigators carries the weight of his entire career behind it. Go back through 5 years of correspondence connected to Savannah Guthrie. Look for the pattern inside the pattern. Look for the correspondent whose messages changed over time, whose tone shifted, whose frequency increased, whose content moved from the general to the specific. Look for the message that mentioned Nancy. Look for the moment where the focus moved from the public figure to the private family member. Because that shift is a behavioral signature. And behavioral signatures, once identified within a documented record, narrow the field of possible individuals from thousands to a handful. Raymond Carr added a dimension to this that reframes the entire 3 months of investigation that preceded the April 30th interview. He stated that this did not begin on the night of January 31st. The crime that took place that night was the end point of a process that had been developing for a long time. The plan required knowledge that takes time to acquire. The execution required preparation that takes time to build. And the psychological state required to move from fixation to action does not emerge suddenly. It builds through the stages that Carr described. Observation, contact, escalation, and finally, the moment where everything the person has been building internally translates into something that exists in the physical world. The night of January 31st was not the beginning. It was the arrival point of a journey that started years earlier in behavior that looked manageable because it had not yet become what it eventually became. Former FBI Assistant Director John Miller's assessment adds the geographic anchor to the behavioral profile. Local. Someone with specific knowledge of the Tucson area and of Nancy Guthrie's living situation. Someone who knew the layout, the routine, the rhythms of a private life that was never meant to be visible to anyone outside a small personal circle. Put those elements together and the profile that emerges is specific. Not a career criminal moving through a pattern of opportunistic offenses. Not a cartel-connected operation or a forced entry driven by desperation. A person with a documented history of contact attempts directed at a public figure. A person local enough to have acquired detailed knowledge of that figure's family member's private life. A person whose psychological investment in a one-sided relationship had escalated over years to the point where proximity to the actual target was no longer sufficient. A person who exists in a file somewhere. Whose name was written down at some point by someone whose job it was to write it down. The CW National Special on May 6th will bring this case back to the front of the national conversation. A second wave of attention reaching people who have been sitting quietly with something they may not yet have connected to the right question. And the investigative framework that Fitzgerald and Carr provided gives that second wave a direction that the first wave never had. Not a general call for tips from anyone who knows anything. A specific call for a specific kind of information. 5 years of correspondence. Contact attempts that were logged and moved past. A person whose behavior shifted around the period before January 31st. A person who expressed something about Savannah Guthrie that landed differently than ordinary admiration. A person whose interest, at some point, moved from the daughter to the mother. The reward is $1.2 million. It is still unclaimed. And the people who have the piece of information that connects the behavioral trail to the name at the end of it are still out there. Some of them may not yet understand what they have. Some of them may be carrying it quietly, waiting for the right question to be asked before they recognize it as the answer. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 3 months. She left a family dinner. She never made it to church the following morning. Her phone was inside the house. Her belongings were untouched. And in the space between those 2 moments, someone entered her home with a plan that had been years in the making. A plan that was never about her. A plan that was about the daughter the world watches every morning. Nancy was simply the door that could be opened. Savannah understood that before the profilers said it. And now the investigators have been given the framework to act on it in a way that the first 3 months of this investigation never fully allowed for. The behavioral trail exists. The correspondence archive exists. The name is in there somewhere. And when that connection is finally made, when the right question gets asked of the right file and the right piece of information finally surfaces, it will not feel like a sudden revelation arriving from nowhere. It will feel like something that was always there. Something that was documented and stored and waiting. Something that only needed to be seen clearly. 3 months of silence does not mean 3 months of nothing. It means 3 months of weight accumulating on something that was never built to hold this much for this long. And right now, on the other side of this case, there is a detail that has not yet been connected. A piece of correspondence that has not yet been pulled from the right archive. A conversation that has not yet been matched to the right moment on the right timeline. That detail is coming. And when the next update on this case breaks, it may not come from a new tip or a new witness. It may come from exactly where James Fitzgerald said to look. A message. A name. A pattern inside a 5-year record that was always there, sitting quietly in a database, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Stay with this channel. Because what comes next in this case may be the detail that finally makes everything visible. The one piece that turns a behavioral profile into a name. And when that happens, you will want to have been here from the beginning to understand exactly what it means and why it matters. The next video covers what investigators have not yet said publicly about the physical evidence recovered at the scene, and why one specific detail from that night has remained deliberately withheld for 3 months. That detail, according to a source with direct knowledge of the investigation, is the piece that changes the direction of everything that comes after it. You cannot afford to miss that one.